Hello everyone, this is Dresden, and welcome to the DEI Faction and Reforms Guide. In this guide, I'll go over what makes different factions unique and how our reform systems work in the mod. As you can see, in the Grand Campaign alone, we have around 45 playable factions. Some of those factions have multiple political parties you can choose at game start. One of our primary goals in the mod is to make it so that each faction feels unique in terms of both battle and campaign play. We also have all factions playable submods, which add a ton of new factions to the playable choices. As you can see, there are also multiple new options for playable factions in the various DLC campaigns, such as the Emperor Augustus campaign, the Caesar and Gaul campaign, and the Hannibal at the Gates campaign. We have added a few different factions you can play in these campaigns, along with redoing the normal factions you can play here up to our standards. We have also added an entirely new campaign. Instead of Wrath of Sparta, you have Macedonian Wars, which is a completely custom campaign designed by the DEI team. Every faction in DEI has faction traits assigned to them. These traits are based on both the faction group and on the individual faction itself. Factions have 2 positive traits and 1 negative trait in order to make for interesting gameplay throughout the course of a campaign. Along with the faction traits, the political tradition and starting challenge of the faction are also listed in this area. The political tradition of a faction refers to its starting government type and also how its political party power level effects will play out inside the politics system. Unfortunately, there's simply no way for me to cover all the different and unique aspects of the various factions in DEI within a short video guide like this. Every faction has a different interaction with our various campaign systems, including the population system, the supply system, our reform system, various bonuses, the stances and traditions of the armies, the culture system with many new and interesting cultures introduced within the campaign, and other various custom systems for individual factions. The Grand Campaign actually has an emergent faction system itself, where every single region can be liberated and you can create an entirely new faction based on the local people in that region. In the future, we may have more specific faction guides, but for now, this will be a general guide on our reforms and roster systems. One way to get an overview of the various faction rosters is to go into the custom battle menu. However, judging a faction just on the custom battle selection is a very poor way of understanding the mod. In DEI, we have over 2,000 custom units, some of which are mercenaries, area of recruitment units, garrison units, and other units that are only found within the campaign. If you look at an individual faction, for example Rome, you will see that all of their reform units are listed together, whereas in the campaign, they will come at different time periods, often replacing previous units. Various factions have different strengths and weaknesses in their rosters. For example, Rome has an auxiliary system and is mainly focused on heavy infantry, while barbarians like the Germans and Iberians have ambush and shock infantry with lots of guerrilla deployment. Successor factions like the Seleucids or the Ptolemies often focus on mercenaries or phalanx type units. Other factions like the Nomads may be missile cavalry oriented and rely on mobility on both the campaign and battle maps. Every faction in DEI has had its roster built from the ground up to have its own unique qualities. And various AI factions have their own rosters so that the player is often faced with different units, which, when added to the AOR system, means that varied armies will show up and hopefully provide an interesting experience. Most factions in DEI have a reform system. Unlike vanilla, these are not tied to the technology tree. Other than the Dacian and nomadic reforms are tied to Imperium level and turn number. Since DEI is 4 turns per year, we couldn't use the historical date because it would be too long of a campaign before you would see any reforms. There are 2 types of reforms in DEI: global reforms and player reforms. Global reforms are for AI factions for the most part and only require a certain turn number. Player reforms require a certain Imperium level on top of that turn number, which means your empire has to reach a certain size before they will trigger. To find out information on our different reforms, you can go to our TWC manual or our Steam page to look at our guide. As you can see, different cultures have different triggers for reforms, mostly based on Imperium level and turn number. Some cultures have more reforms than others. Also, factions like Armenia and the Thracian factions rely on Greek global reforms for their triggers. Dacian factions have their own reform system, as do the nomadic factions. Reforms are also in various DLC campaigns. For example, Rome starts at Imperial reforms in the IA campaign, at Marian reforms in the Caesar and Gaul campaign, and at Plebeian reforms in both the Hannibal and Macedonian War campaigns. Not all campaigns have the ability to trigger new reform units, but some do. In recent updates, we've also fixed some of the multiplayer reform bugs, so those of you that like co-op will be able to experience these reforms without having to worry too much about desyncs and other bugs with reform units. When a faction hits a new reform tier, various new units will be opened up. However, some other older units may also go away. Reforms represent changes and differences over time in tactics and equipment, not necessarily a direct improvement at every reform tier. When a reform fires, you will get a message about that reform and some historical information surrounding the changes. Some units will be upgradable after a reform hits. In order to have the upgrades work properly, and also to have most reforms work properly, make sure you research the upgrade technology. This technology is a purple technology normally found in the first military tree of a faction. You can research this technology at any time, but make sure you do it before the reforms hit. That's it for this guide. Hopefully in the future we have some more in-depth faction guides. Thanks for watching. If you want to support the mod, check out our Patreon page, or check out Steam or our TWC forums.